In this last half of the documentary, we will continue to discuss the influence of politics when it comes to race and its overall consequence on society, with the focus being on the United States of America. In the first installment, we discussed the first half of American history, and for this reason, we will be talking about the years of 1877 to the present day. In this segment, it is noticeable that other races, not just African Americans, make their presence known in the U.S. government and its history. Before jumping straight to 1877, there is one piece of background that happened 2 years prior to our starting point, on March 1st in 1875. During this specific day, the Civil Rights Act was passed by Congress, which gave equal rights to blacks when it came to jury duty and accommodation. Sneak peek to about 10 years later, this act was overturned on October 15, 1883, thus allowing individuals and corporations to discriminate based on race. When it comes to the branches of government and their orders and laws concerning race, it is a striking reminder of Aristotle's belief that the best/highest ends are those who are in charge of creating laws for all. This is considered the progressive development of man, in which certain people are chosen to lead humanity. Along with this is Kant's idea of a racial hierarchy. Based on historical accounts and as seen throughout the video, African Americans and other races in general did not have a prominent presence in government, thus allowing the whites to completely take over the country, and for that reason allowed them to be on top of the social hierarchy. Fortunately, this did not go unnoticed, so other races, especially African Americans, began their climb up the social ladder. One example is the making of the Tuskegee Institute for Black students who were training to be teachers on July 4th in 1881. Booker T. Washington was the main teacher of this institute and made it known that education was necessary in order to be successful in life as a human and especially as a non-white person. John Locke preached that reason not only interprets the law, but also executes the law. And according to all other philosophers, the only way to have any type of reason is to be educated of one's environment and of one's history. This is why the creation of this institute is so vital towards African American progress in American society. In Locke's State of Nature, it is noted that equality and freedom is equivalent to the right to determine for oneself what is right and wrong, and ultimately this created the notion of autonomy. On the other hand, other races were not moving towards progress as shown through the Chinese Exclusion Act, where Chinese immigration was halted with only a few exceptions being allowed in, such as skilled laborers, in order to prevent any type of overpopulation and so that the Chinese would not take all the jobs away from the Americans. Like Paul C. Taylor said, the human population is made up of smaller groups, more like each other, than they are like members of other groups. This means that cultures tend to stick with their types of people and are hesitant to mingle and mix with other cultures, whether it be for fear of being defeated in cultural ways or to just maintain a certain type of reputation that allows them to keep their good name. For this reason, like what the Americans did to the Irish when they first emigrated, is that they made sure that their presence was known in a way that showed superiority so that 1. Their jobs would not be taken away, and 2. Their culture would not be altered in any way as well. When Ellis Island opened up on January 1st of 1892, the mixing of cultures was inevitable. The response of American citizens was not immediately evident, but there was definitely some hostility towards the new immigrants, and overpowering fear towards being replaced by a new race in their home. Eventually, the mixing of races proved to be beneficial for the country for a short while, but only after some discourse and problematic situations. For example, there was a Supreme Court case of Plessy v. Ferguson held on May 18th of 1896, in which the justices decided that racial segregation is in fact constitutional and thus paved way for the creation of the Jim Crow laws. This echoes the idea shown in the reading talking about how whiteness is a lie, because it talked about how whiteness is exclusion and uncultured. The creation of Jim Crow laws were designed to completely disregard the African American race as a whole, while humiliating their existence at the same time. It also made the African Americans fear their life at a 24/7 rate, especially when in the presence of whites, and thus accomplishing the concept of whiteness. To provide a visual, I will use an excerpt from Richard Wright's Ethics of Living Jim Crow that showed the fear and anxiety that overcame the entire black community. The mother of the protagonist says, quote, "How come you didn't hide?" End quote, as if the confrontation was the black child's fault, when in reality the whites were the ones who started an argument with the innocent black boy. This shows just the mildest of problems that the black community faced during the ruling of Jim Crow laws and white superiority. Skipping over a decade, we are suddenly in 1909, where another advancement by African Americans towards some sort of equality or having some sort of voice in society is accomplished through the conduction of the National Conference of the Negro, which eventually led to the formation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, a group that discussed white values and believed that they had the solution to the concept of race, claiming that it was not necessarily a reality, but rather just an ambiguous idea. This civil rights organization is biracial and was formed in order to advance justice for the African American people in political, educational, economical, and societal circumstances. Coincidentally, this group was mentioned in Schuyler's novel Black No More, but in a satirical manner. He condemns the ways in which race functions as not only an obsession for the American people, but also as a commodity that can be considered valuable in certain situations, depending on who is involved. Since the organization was founded by mainly white people, it crossed a bridge between the race gap, but some people, like George Schuyler, found this to be an act that did not truly intend to reach justice for all. For a couple decades, race's impact on politics and American history is quiet for a while, but comes back to life during the initiation of World War II. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th of 1941, the fear and anxiety of the American citizens heightened dramatically, and thus provoked the government to declare war on both Germany and Japan just a few days after the attack. A couple months later, on February 19th of 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which confined 110,000 Japanese Americans, including 75,000 citizens on the West Coast, into internment camps in response to the Pearl Harbor attacks. Once again, like mentioned earlier, the fear and anxiety of the American people influences them to demonstrate their power when they feel threatened by another culture or race, and in this case, it is because they fear their life. It is believed that internment camps are brought about due to the successful integration of racial minorities alongside the notion of prejudice. Although it is true that the Japanese did successfully integrate into American society, as seen by the numbers and population, that is not the only reason that they were placed into camps. The fear and anxiety juxtaposed with the feeling of potential Japanese spies for the Japanese government residing in the country influenced FDR to act in such a manner. For this reason, in 1944, during the case of Korematsu versus the United States, the Supreme Court ruled the Japanese exclusion of 1942 as constitutional, since it protected the citizens of the U.S. in a time of terror. Other future events did not have that type of quote-unquote justification as seen on July 21st of 1943, where race riots occurred in Detroit and Harlem which caused 40 deaths and injured 700. This was somewhat caused by the successful integration of blacks in these areas, but also when matched with the growing population, emergence, and strength of the Ku Klux Klan, it was inevitable to avoid an unfortunate occurrence such as this. Like mentioned earlier, the concept of education is important when it comes to both reason and knowledge within a society. That is why the case of Brown versus Board Education of Topeka, Kansas, in which it was declared that racial segregation in school was unconstitutional in 1954, is so monumental. This is true for a few different reasons. It was obvious that school and community conditions of black communities were significantly less maintained than those of white communities due to lack of funding and constant fighting for assistance from other community members and from the government. When the schools were integrated, it caused a ruckus between the whites and blacks, causing a bunch of protests to occur, which made the Supreme Court step in and say that all public schools must integrate with deliberate speed. This was once again provoked by fear and anxiety of both races, both blacks and whites. The idea of integration was something foreign and something that would have mixed races and thus messed with the maintenance of white culture and society as well as black culture and society. This thus emphasized the notion of blackness as metaphysical and how the whites focused on the idea of blackness as distinct from race. They believed that blackness was equivalent to social problems and that black people were in fact problematic people. They rattled the consistency of white culture, which had been preserved for hundreds of years, with the help of the highest power of government, the ones of reason, the lawmakers, which made them feel like blacks were starting to become their equals. When integration occurred, the confidence of the black community rose, and it was evident through the emergence of sudden civil rights activists, such as Rosa Parks, who stood her ground against a white man when she refused to give her seat up on the bus. This is a moment that will live in history because it was not only a step forward for the black community, but also for women. This also then led to another declaration made by the Supreme Court in which they said segregation laws on buses were unconstitutional, which was another win for the black community as a whole and not just for Parks. Not only were their efforts being recognized by the country, but they were starting to receive mutual treatment, at least they were supposed to as written by the laws, from the powerful white society. This is where the ideas of early philosophers begin to be challenged by history. Why then are the lawmakers, the most reasonable of all, being challenged by their own people, when in fact they are the ones on top of the social hierarchy? Here's my answer to that. In my opinion, it was a way to overthrow the lawmakers because of the disturbance towards the consistency of white superiority that had been existent for hundreds of years already. It was a familiar sensation that when the power was ever so slightly taken away from them, they had to act in a way that fought back. But it couldn't have just been something small. It had to be something big, something that grabbed everyone's attention. And that is why I believe the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan was so prominent during this time period. And that is also how Birth of a Nation explained their existence as well. They donned white robes to remind society that they were still powerful and existent, and that they should not be forgotten as a race, and that they would not be eliminated by another race, the black race, that is being assisted by the ones they once believed was on their side, that being the government. To further elaborate on this claim, in 1957, Congress approved of yet another bill towards civil rights, which added more protection towards voting rights. Suddenly, tables have turned for the better, but not in the mind of the white society. Those with reason are in government, and the most reasonable are lawmakers. But all of a sudden, mostly all blacks were now able to choose who these lawmakers were, and thus pretty much said that they had reason. This then provoked the white society in a negative manner. They were angry and wanted to fight against it using Jim Crow laws, but they were slowly becoming defeated by their own government. In this circumstance, it is almost as if the whites were stuck in, quote unquote, a permanent reality, end quote, one in which they created a world for themselves, where there were no changes to the world they lived in before, so that they can maintain a concrete identity. This is a concept discussed in Nella Larsen's Passing when it came to Irene. For this reason, it is safe to say that Irene resembled white society and Claire was the black society because they are both transporting themselves into a new world in order to better their life no matter the cost. Not convinced yet? We'll continue in time. On August 28, 1963, the famous Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech at Lincoln Memorial, where over 200,000 people watched and participated in a march. the Lincoln Memorial is significant because it is the statue of a man who ultimately freed the slaves from the reigns of the white people, and therefore there is some symbolism in the location of his speech. Furthermore, it is on the government's ground. Once again, he is symbolizing reason. Not only is he in Washington, D.C., the capital of the country and the major location for government run facilities, but he is also delivering a speech full of eloquent words and phrases alongside a voice that contained power and confidence. This speech was monumental and showed a transition of all blacks towards a new world. It was basically passing because they finally climbed that social ladder, and no matter how anyone felt, they were basically equals to the whites in both reason and knowledge. For this reason, it is not surprising that the whites' continuous feeling of fear and anxiety towards another race was brought about again during this time. 2 years later, on March 7th, white state troopers, attacked a peaceful demonstration led by Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma, Alabama. It didn't matter if it was a peaceful or violent one. The fear and anxiety of the whites became too overbearing that they had to act immediately, and thus the white society used someone higher than them on the social hierarchy, the cops, because they are the ones who abide by the laws the most, even though it starts to become evident that some do not care about just the law, but the continuation of the emergence of their race and superiority. Continuing, the social hierarchy reached an important milestone on October 2nd of 1967 when Thurgood Marshall was sworn into office as the first African American Supreme Court Justice. A member of the black community reached the highest potential step on the societal ladder in which he became part of the lawmaking group, thus proving that African Americans and other races, not just whites, are capable of having reason and knowledge and thus have power. I know I am skipping over a lot of time, but we are now going to discuss events of the 1990s and the 2000s because it gives us a glance over a different group of people. Because I know we have talked a lot about African American influence on politics and American history, that it felt necessary to talk about other races as well, since they are significant to the history of the country. It is evident in modern day society that there is a lot of fear towards the Arabic countries and their peoples. When did this all begin? It is possible that there were previous events that led to the development of this fear, but there were a few major occurrences during the 90s and early 2000s that definitely contributed to this feeling. It is not talked about significantly, but in 1993, on February 26, there was a bombing in the World Trade Center, which was plotted by Islamic terrorists and ended in 6 people dead and over 1,000 injured. Things were quiet for a short while, but in 1998, the founder of Al Qaeda, a network that consisted of Islamic extremists, Osama bin Laden, published his fatwa, which announced a jihad against all Jews and crusaders. This event is significant because it pushed forward the Islamic fundamentalist agenda towards terrorism against the Western world. For this reason, on the infamous date of September 11th, 2001, the World Trade Center was attacked once again, as well as the Pentagon by the extremist organization, Al Qaeda. This definitely significantly heightened the fear of Americans towards the Muslim people and prompted the development of high-tech security through the passage of the Aviation and Transportation Security Act, which then created the Transportation Security Administration, or TSA. This then echoes Hegel's belief about technologically advanced people. He said that those who were more technologically advanced were closer to becoming European, which meant that they were more likely to be at the top of the social hierarchy because they were white, knowledgeable, and reasonable. Although this is not the reason the American government made their decision to have more high-tech security, it shows how fear of the influence of other races provokes the country to revert back to the old ways of promoting their power and potential superiority to others. Additionally, it was not passed by a bill per se, but it was evident through data that there was sort of a ban towards Muslim immigrants mostly towards Pakistan citizens because the number of tourist visas given to them fell almost 70%. Furthermore, anti Islamic violence rose significantly during this time period, which could be blamed once again on the fear and anxiety of the American people. This caused people to become prejudiced towards the Muslim people, even after their successful integration in the American community. Other events occur that include the Muslim community, such as the war in Iraq during the presidency of George W. Bush and Barack Obama. This war symbolized the existing terror towards the Muslim people, especially the extremist groups who continuously threatened the lives of the American citizens, which then made them need to act immediately. It is now then important to talk about the election of 2008, where the first African American president was elected with a landslide victory in the Electoral College with 363 votes to 173. This is significant for a number of reasons. One, it showed that the African American people could finally be recognized as reasonable because the number one lawmaker is a part of their society, when hundreds of years ago it was believed to be only a job for whites who were at the top of the social ladder. In addition, it resembled a little bit of racial passing. The American people were able to look past the color of Barack Obama and solely focused on his ideas to improve the country in politics, education, and a community sense. For this reason, we return to Paul C. Taylor's novel, in which he believes that America had become post racial in the age of Obama because he handled immigration as not an issue, but as a matter of reality. He promoted the mixture of races and thus relieved the fear towards immigration in existence in the country, but only for a short while. This is why the 2016 election is the most shocking when it comes to talking about American history. When Donald Trump was elected into office, it was heartbreaking to millions of people, but also a victory for others. Why? It is definitely hard to explain. It is believed that his ambition and vocalization of ideas that were never uttered before, such as the creation of the wall along the US Mexican border and the rapid deportation of the many illegal immigrants on American soil, captured an audience that was quieted by the move of the other races up the social ladder. Without a solid foundation, that being the government, to support their ideas towards the continuance of white superiority, the idea of the latter was disregarded for a few decades, maybe even at least 100 years. This then brings us to the idea of model minorities. In Trump's America, there is a sudden move towards blaming the immigrants for all that has gone wrong in the country, especially when it comes to the lack of jobs. Model minorities create an existential pressure for those of other races, which could be based on the constant fear of being sent back to their home country or being threatened by all the new laws that are used against them. This is occurring because white Americans are once again showing their feelings of terror towards losing their spot on the social ladder because their successes are now in the hands of the other races. This then makes them want to disregard their home culture and integrate themselves completely into the white society so that they are seen as equals, but somehow appearances are back as an indication of identity. For this reason, only time will tell how Trump's America will evolve and how the other races will react to the changes in the responses of the white society.